Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Benjamin Bratton reads his piece Not Right Now, a critique of the intellectual valorization of immediacy within art, and the ironies of life in a hypermediated world.
Immediatization and its contentedness. One of the many ironies of life in a hypermediated world is the intellectual valorization of immediacy and the earnest pursuit of presence and hyperexposure as a personal strategy against power. As mediation becomes more pervasive, essential, and confusing, the personal experience of what is right here, right now, is awarded seemingly limitless prestige. But at what cost? Anna Kornbluh's Immediacy is a fluid guide to how we got here. She writes that unrepresentative personalism becomes an epistemic silo and political prophylactic, and indeed it does. It corresponds, she says, with a suspension of reflection and a militant suspicion of abstraction that allows the outside world in only to the extent that it serves as a thematic backdrop for one's protagonist syndrome. As a new way of doing what he calls critical theory to address the big crises of the day, Columbia Law and Political Science professor Bernard Harcourt declares that every one of us must write in the first person. Sure, the Anthropocene is a big deal, but at the end of the day, it's really about you. This tendency builds on the hard-fought insights of the personal is political, but actually inverts the political into nothing but the personal. The first-person idiom is politics as memoir, an approach fully compatible with the ambient solipsism of our times. The pervasiveness of Harcourt's vision is why Chris Kraus's book showing up on Oprah's recommended reading list doesn't surprise anyone anymore. This cultural megagenre is characterized by an intensely confessional prose, posture, and point of view. Its confessionalism oscillates between Catholic forgiveness ritual and Maoist struggle session. As it flip-flops between the two, self-help is affirmed as the most raw, authentic form of communitarian politics. The performance of subjectivity, as naked, mindful catharsis, takes over for the struggle, not the other way around. And yet, this performance claims to have the equivalent counter-hegemonic effect. Agency is reduced to subjectivity is reduced to identity, and identity is reduced to confession. Nowhere is this more true than in the world of art. One thing not about you. Several semesters ago, I taught a studio in our program at the University of California, San Diego, and I gave the students what I thought was a simple prompt: to make a project about something other than themselves and their autobiography or their lived experience. This prompt received more pushback than any I have ever given. The blowback was swift and personal. Some students produced good work, but others refused the brief altogether for two related reasons. First, their art practice is so inextricably tied to their being an artist that to separate the two would be, they claimed, an erasure of their identity, and even, as stated by one, a violent silencing. The second response was more pragmatic. Their ability to succeed as a professional artist depends on how their work reflects their persona and, in not so many words, their brand as an artist. And so to make work that does not further this career requirement is a time-wasting distraction. So some students didn't want to work with the prompt because to imagine the relevance of the world independent of their subjective experience is proto-traumatic. Others refused because of how cognizant they are of their place in an art world outside of their control to which they must conform. In the end, we all had a good and difficult discussion about the differences between these responses. One conclusion, drawn by some but not all of the students, was that similar to conspiracy theorists who prefer to believe that governments can coordinate plots with exacting foresight rather than accept that the world is chaotic, Practitioners of institutional critique are the last true believers in the power of art institutions. No one is actually moved by the heroic revelation that art museums are nodal conductors of financial capital, or that past curatorial decisions bear the imprint of their histories. Another conclusion, also far from unanimous, was that their experience of the art world was akin to a durational restaging of the Asch conformity experiment, one in which test subjects are pressured to channel ideas through autofiction, auto-theory, auto-sculpture, and a lot of auto-performance, even when doing so is absurd. Here, auto meant both autonomous, my own self, and automatic, from the personal as political to subjectivity as format. Why do so many exhibitions speak of the artist's special obligation to speak truth to power and to mobilize their special sensitivity to bear witness to injustice, as if society as a whole depends on them to say what must be said? Climate change? Let's ask an artist. Gaza? I wonder what the MFAs at Yale think. But art is not these presumed duties. Art is a precious capacity for creative aesthetic abstraction available to all humans, honed since the Neolithic era. Art exists, but the artist, in quotes, is a myth, a vestigial position from a more theological time, when the link between aesthetics and mysticism was firmer, and when the professional outsider had a more credible claim on deeper truth. That residue is persistent, however, because it confers economic and social value. The premise of art washing, for example, is based on a conceit that art occupies a moral high ground, confers honor by proximity, and must be vigilant against others' coercing association by inappropriately extracting its ethical prestige. Arguably, however, the real dynamic is the inverse. Art regularly employs politics washing by wrapping itself in serious issues to give gravitas to superficial gestures, and institution washing by constructing awards, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, named dedications, board seats, annual selections, etc., so as to pool and earn interest on its cultural capital. The two dovetail as art constructs institutions out of nothing, then celebrates the critique of these institutions, using them as the platform for their own deconstruction, and enjoying preferential tax status for these good deeds. Despite its discursive revolt against the vague and totalizing specter of capitalism, art is nothing if not a highly processed asset class, as many artists and art critics and art historians and art dealers regularly bemoan with both sincerity and cynicism. Every day, major works are bought and sold, careers are made and unmade by arms dealers and pop stars because their financial advisor suggests Julie Meritou as a hedge against platinum futures. The summer of NFTs collapsed the teeny-weeny space in art between satire and the satirized. It made even more clear that not only is its world an intricate mechanism for commodified vacuousness, but for this to work, it must be balanced by countercultural moral triumphalism. Critical art is not the adversary of art financialization. It is its essential alibi. The more radical the art, the better the alibi. Win-win. As we know, art journals, reviews, curatorial issuances, and artist statements are articulated in a Baroque patois of post-structuralist prose and activist manifesto as filtered through the syntactic creativity of the non-native speaker, known as International Art English, IAE. A future AI may determine that the origins of this dialect lay in how American graduate students in the 1980s cut their teeth on awkward English translations of now canonical French and German texts that were evasive in the original, Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida most obviously, and who imitated these semantic distortions to write as a practiced style. If so, International Art English is only international because it is another American cultural export. People from all continents write in English based on how Americans imitated how they thought Europeans write. A classic case of data degradation and model collapse. I submit that this language contains not just a pretentious way of writing, but that its self-reducing monotony also expresses a regular and specific point of view. International Art English not only describes art with goofy words, but produces and is the vehicle for international art theory, IAT. The basic tenets are clear. Everything worthy of consideration is a hybrid. Everything juxtaposes, everything challenges, everything is a proposition, everything contemplates, everything does something to the viewer, everything is radically this and that, everything is an experience for a community, everything definitely relates to power and vulnerability and is, of course, liminal. Good culture, therefore, means community experience of liminal hybrids proposing to the viewer a radical challenge that contemplates a vulnerable juxtaposition of power. But what if it's not? What if this theory is actually a stupid theory? Marshall Solins proposed that paradigms in the humanities lose significance not when they can no longer explain enough, but rather when they come to explain everything. Such is the status, he suggested, of the Foucauldian connotation of power. From restaurant menus to electric chairs, it's all power. The same principle applies to international art theory's incoherently tribalist embrace of individualist anarchism and all the contradictions that entails. Paul Valeri's chestnut that everything changes but the avant-garde described the circular orthodoxy of international art theory in advance. That circularity inevitably produces art practices built specifically for the reenactment of earlier art works and practices. Like the fellow who started off in a Judas Priest cover band and then found himself singing on tour with a real band, some artists aspire to and fully achieve karaoke recreations of Judy Chicago or Mike Kelly or John Baldessari or whoever. And who can blame them? This feedback effect is a feature of their milieu, not a bug. Art itself may be preoccupied with the repetitive expression of the artist's subjectivity, but are the crowds of people who rotate the turnstiles any different? Just like the artist, what they most crave is to see themselves in the work, or at least that's what curators and museum boards suppose. How we ended up with selfie museums is not mysterious. It's partially the result of a shift of all art into selfie art, as perceived by those MFA students nervous about going off-brand. After a couple decades of the mind-numbing narcissism of the artist as present, the twee collective infantilization of relational aesthetics, the preening condescension of socially engaged art, garish trauma reenactments, various blinky-blink interactive contraptions, paperweight versions of giant metal cartoon characters, and so on, you get what you asked for. Besides the general pandering to closed-loop thinking, the really big cause, however, is an uncritical embrace of representationalism. This may be defined as a confusion between A, widening the scope of included art in artists beyond the usual global north metropolitan circuits to include a wider range of vibrant human creative production, with B, the simplistic populism that supposes the purpose of a museum is so that everyone can see and feel themselves represented in the artwork as literally as possible. Corresponding with Anna Kornbluth's thesis on immediacy, this representationalist recognition must be immediate in both senses, experienced very quickly to keep the crowd moving, and also viscerally without complicated pedagogy. In place of wall texts offering a curatorial argument, viewers are now presented with an open mic experience. What do you think about what you see? The inevitable consequence is the theme park museum, what Brad Trammell calls adult daycare centers, designed to frame customer subjectivity on elaborate stages next to charismatic objects and to provide them with the opportunity to document and socialize this experience. Anything and everything is mobilized to congratulate the artist and the museum goer as collaborative protagonists, each affirming their first-personness through the other. We live as we dream, alone. The significance of the concept of the Anthropocene was, at least for a moment, to demystify and collapse the culture-nature dualism similar to what neuroscience did to the mind-body dualism. In the place of this dualism are broadly overlapping geospheres, biospheres, technospheres, and perhaps noospheres, though I remain suspicious of how this last term's theological tenor in the West reintroduces older idealist concepts of mind. However, that moment didn't last very long, in the humanities anyway. The tenacity of social reductionism and cultural determinism demanded that the planetary be subordinated to the realm of human social and economic relations, symbolic representation, and the moral accounting of recent history. That recent changes in planetary systems were caused by human historical misadventures was confused with the more fundamental insight of the Anthropocene, one already clarified by Depeche Chakrabarty and others, that all human history not only transforms planetary processes, but is an expression of them. The planetary is not only artificialized, the planetary always precedes and exceeds the human history that it discharges. This is alien to an environmental humanities that sees the planetary as a spiritual form wounded by the external force of human rationality. But it is not external. Rationality is something that planets do through a species such as ourselves. Further, the ecological precarity of the present is the result less of technological reason, a process that deduced the existence of climate change in the first place, than the presumption that the planet was infinitely available, not just for use, but more importantly for experience, and for the experience of one's experience. Immediatism and hypersubjectivism are not the frontline resistance against the root cause of anthropocentric avarice. They are that avarice's purest incarnation. Maybe the storm of subjectivity is a sign, more than anything else, of an intense loneliness, less an attempt to prove that one exists than the natural response to a feeling that no one else exists. Where are we? What is here and now? We are all alone together in the most literal sense. Humans have established a more scientific understanding of the astronomic reality of our cosmic predicament in the last century than in the previous millions of years of hominid evolution. From Edwin Hubble's observational confirmation in the 1920s that other galaxies exist beyond the Milky Way, to the space telescope named after him, which in 2006 showed clusters of galaxies, the faintest of which extend back through the beginning of time. Life on Earth's new conceptions of its real place and position scaled rapidly. Among the most chilling discoveries is the extent of the void all around us. In 1984, Soviet astronomer Josef Shklovsky and Carl Sagan met for the last time in Graz, Austria. Both scientists were instrumental in cooperative SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Having debated the Drake equation for years, which estimated the number of technologically advanced civilizations that might be capable of contacting Earth, Shklovsky was beginning to have doubts. Perhaps we are alone after all, he pondered. His doubt may have been religiously inspired, or based simply on the lack of success in finding alien signals. In Graz, he communicated this apprehension to Sagan, a longtime proponent of the idea that the universe is teeming with neighbors, and left his American counterpart, quote, somewhat unmoored. If the discovery of extraterrestrial life would be the most philosophically significant event imaginable, Shklovsky reasoned, second only to communication with that life, then is the realization that the unfathomable distances of space guarantee that Earth is, for all practical purposes, alone, not an equally profound conclusion. As Peggy Lee once asked, is that all there is? If the fundamental unit of life is not a cell but a planet, as some astrobiologists believe, then perhaps like a cell, Earth life will eventually multiply beyond itself. In the meantime, a slice of the biosphere and technosphere, namely humans and anthropogenic technologies, produce images that are immeasurably more profound than any painting in any biennale. The James Webb Space Telescope in 2022 produced images of ancient light bending around early galaxies before reaching us. In contrast with the blue marble image taken by astronaut Harrison Schmitt, later a climate change-denying US senator, an icon that implied both planetary fragility and the primacy of an anthropocentric observational perspective, Webb Space Telescope's images imply something very different. The depth of the real is a spectacularly beautiful, an utterly indifferent elastic void. Is the consequence of this to take comfort in the idea that the fullness of eternity resides most of all in the instantaneousness of experience? Compared to the life of a galaxy, the whole of terrestrial biology is a blip, and in a sliver of that blip is the picosecond of human language. Are we fooling ourselves? Is the immediate not what refuses the lesson of deep time, but what accepts the death sentence it implies? Is the decision to live in the moment, as if the moment was made just for you to experience it, finally the same thing as thinking through one's life in the full context of space-time? In fact, it is not. To even ask these questions seriously, not frivolously, is to inhabit a long-duration project of abstraction, of distance, alienation, depersonalization, scaffolding, quantification as qualitative judgment, and mediation in all its guises. These are not what distracts each of us from the intensity of being alive, but what focuses our patient attention on its strangeness.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.